If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.
Story 1. The Visitor. The clock struck 11 p.m. on a quiet Wednesday night, and Lisa was settled comfortably in her favorite armchair, watching reruns of an old sitcom. She had recently moved to this neighborhood for a fresh start, leaving behind a busy city life for the peace and calm of the suburbs. The streets here were quiet, the houses spaced apart, and on most nights, she could hear nothing but the wind brushing the leaves outside her windows. Tonight, however, was different. The moment she pressed play on the next episode, she heard it, a soft, insistent knock on the front door. At first, she brushed it off. It was late, and she didn't expect anyone. But as the knocking continued, slow, steady, and rhythmic, Lisa began to grow uneasy. Her closest neighbor, an elderly woman named Ruth, was usually asleep by this hour. Who would be at her door so late? She reached the door, peering through the peephole into the dark night beyond. But there was no one there. She turned on the porch light, its yellow glow casting long shadows over the empty pathway leading up to her house. Maybe it was just a prank, she thought. After all, teenagers roamed the neighborhood now and then, daring each other to do something harmless but frightening for a laugh. But something about the knock felt off. It wasn't rushed or hurried, like the knock of a prankster. It was deliberate, like someone who was waiting for her. She returned to her armchair, doing her best to shake off the lingering sense of dread. But as she settled in, her phone buzzed on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with a new message. The subject line read, "Missed you." Curious, she unlocked her phone and opened the message, only to see a photograph of her house. Her breath hitched. The picture was taken from her front door, the very door where she had just been standing moments ago. As if that wasn't enough to send chills down her spine, the photo had a caption, "Next time, open up." Lisa's heart thumped wildly in her chest. She felt the instinctive urge to grab her keys, run out of the house, and get in her car. But the thought of running into whoever had sent the message was somehow even more terrifying. She took a steadying breath and checked the sender. It was a random number, unfamiliar and untraceable. Her fingers trembled as she typed back, "Who is this?" Seconds passed, then minutes. Silence. No reply. The phone screen returned to black, leaving her alone in the dim light of her living room. Unable to shake her unease, she decided to walk through the house, double-checking every lock and window. Each click of a deadbolt brought a small sense of security. She moved upstairs, making sure the bedroom windows were secure, and even checked the back door. Everything was locked up tight. But when she returned to the living room, her phone buzzed again. Another message. Her fingers hovered above the screen as she unlocked it, dread curling in the pit of her stomach. The new message was a voice note. She hesitated, her thumb lingering above the play button. Finally, she pressed it, holding her breath. The voice that came through was distorted, deep and haunting, almost a whisper, "I'm watching you." Panic surged through her, and she rushed to the windows, scanning the empty street. There was nothing, just the gentle sway of trees in the wind. She called the police, explaining the situation as calmly as she could manage. An officer arrived within 15 minutes, walking around her property with a flashlight, checking every possible hiding spot. But he found nothing. "Probably just some kids messing around," he said, trying to reassure her, though his own face held an edge of concern. "Call us if anything else happens, okay?" She nodded, but the officer's words didn't ease her anxiety. She could feel someone watching her, even as she closed the door and locked it once more. Hours ticked by. The adrenaline eventually faded, and she dozed off in her chair. But in the early hours of the morning, she woke to a loud banging, a relentless pounding on her door. She jolted awake, heart racing as the banging grew louder, more urgent. It didn't sound like the careful, measured knock from before. This time, it was angry, demanding. It echoed through the empty house, rattling her nerves. "Who's there?" she called out, but there was no answer. After a moment's hesitation, she grabbed a flashlight and edged toward the door, pressing her ear to the wood. She could hear breathing, slow and deep, just on the other side. When she dared to look through the peephole, she was met with darkness. But this darkness wasn't the emptiness of night, it was solid, something standing just on the other side, blocking her view entirely. A low, rumbling voice whispered her name, so close it sounded as if it was inside her head. Lisa. She stumbled back, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a scream. She backed away slowly, watching the door with wide eyes. The knocking stopped, and a suffocating silence settled over the house. But then her phone buzzed again. With a shaky hand, she picked it up. Another picture had arrived, and this one was worse than the last. It was a close-up of her living room window, taken from the outside. In the photograph, Lisa could see her own shadowy figure standing in the darkened room, her terrified expression barely visible through the glass. The caption read, "I'm closer than you think." Her mind raced, her thoughts spiraling. Could someone have been in her yard? Watching her every move, photographing her without her ever noticing? She spent the rest of the night hiding in the bathroom, her only safe haven, with her back pressed against the cold tile wall. She sat there, waiting for the dawn, hoping the sunlight would banish whatever was haunting her. When the first rays of morning finally broke through, she emerged cautiously. Exhausted and on edge, she spent the day looking over her shoulder, her every movement accompanied by a gnawing paranoia. That evening, her phone buzzed once more. This time, the message contained no text, no photo, just a link to a live video feed. She clicked on it against her better judgment. Her screen filled with an image of her living room, filmed from an angle high up in the corner. She could see herself, standing in the exact spot where she was now, staring down at her phone. With growing horror, she realized the feed was being streamed from a camera inside her house. She dropped the phone, backing away in terror, her heart slamming against her ribs. She had locked every window, every door. How could someone have gotten inside? And then, the voice returned. Louder, clearer, echoing from the phone still lying on the floor. It sounded closer now, as though it were coming from within the walls themselves. Next time, it whispered, "I won't just watch." The following day, Lisa packed her bags, leaving behind everything she owned. She couldn't bear to live in that house anymore, knowing that whoever, or whatever, had tormented her could still be lurking inside, waiting for her return. Weeks passed, and she tried to forget, tried to convince herself it had been a nightmare. But every so often, late at night, her phone would light up with a notification from an unknown number, and she'd catch a glimpse of a photograph, her old house, taken from the front door. And she'd wonder if the visitor was still waiting for her. Story 2. The Whispering Walls. Jack and his friends, Emma, Cole, and Sarah, were all looking for a break from their busy lives, and a weekend at an old, secluded cabin seemed like the perfect escape. Jack's uncle had owned the cabin years ago, but it had been abandoned for over a decade. The thought of a rustic, quiet getaway in the woods appealed to them. They packed their gear, eager for a weekend of peace, campfires, and ghost stories. The cabin was old, covered in ivy and weathered by years of neglect, with creaking wooden floors and faded paint peeling from the walls. Inside, the air was stale, but there was a cozy charm that seemed to welcome them. After settling in and lighting a fire, the group huddled in the dim living room, laughing and sharing stories as the sun dipped below the horizon. As midnight approached, they decided to turn in. Jack took the small bedroom at the back, while Emma and Cole chose the bunk beds in the main room. Sarah opted for the couch, stretching out near the warmth of the dwindling fire. It was silent and peaceful, the only sound being the crackling embers. But around 3 a.m., Jack stirred. He could hear faint murmuring, like a soft whisper coming from the walls. At first, he thought it was the wind pushing through the old, warped wood. But as he lay there, the whispers seemed to grow more distinct, more intentional. He could swear he heard his name. Jack. The voice was a low, drawn-out hiss, like someone exhaling into his ear. Jack shivered, brushing it off as a vivid dream. He turned over and forced himself to ignore it, finally drifting back into a fitful sleep. But he wasn't the only one hearing things. In the bunk beds, Emma was wide awake, her ears catching faint, hushed voices, her name, followed by something she could barely understand. It sounded like a warning, but she couldn't make out the words. The voice was strange, layered, almost as if several people were whispering at once. Morning came, and everyone gathered around the fireplace, sharing bleary looks and nervous laughter. "Did anyone else hear things last night?" Emma asked, her voice a whisper, almost afraid of the answer. The others nodded. Cole, usually the skeptic, shrugged it off, claiming it was just the house settling or the wind. "This place is old. The wood's probably warped and creaks when it gets cold," he said, trying to ease the tension. But as they explored the cabin that morning, they noticed something that made their stomachs twist. Deep scratches lined the inside of the walls in the hallway and living room. The marks were jagged, uneven, as though someone, or something, had raked long claws through the wooden panels. And worse, the scratches seemed to spell out one word, faint but unmistakable: stay. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence waning. But determined not to let some creepy scratches ruin their trip, they laughed it off as a prank someone must have played years ago. They spent the day hiking and swimming in the nearby river, slowly forgetting the strange events of the night. But as the sun set, an uneasy silence settled over them again. Shadows crept into the corners of the cabin, and the atmosphere grew thick with an unnatural stillness. That night, they all heard it, the whispers, louder now, insistent, like a chorus of unseen voices closing in around them. "Emma," the voice whispered. "Cole. Sarah. Jack." They each lay frozen in their beds, hearing their own names called out softly, spoken by voices that somehow knew them intimately. And it wasn't just their names, each whisper spoke of secrets, fears, and memories that no one else could know. "Jack, remember when you were 7 and hid in the closet, afraid they'd find you?" "Emma, that night you lost your dog in the woods, the guilt you still feel." "Sarah, your promise to your grandmother, never to be broken." The whispers taunted them with these memories, twisted them into threats, filling the dark with their words. Cole, unable to stand it any longer, leapt from his bed and threw open the door to the hallway, expecting to find a prankster hiding behind the walls. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice shaking. "Show yourself." The whispers fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of his heavy breathing, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway. But then, from somewhere deeper in the house, he heard a soft, chilling reply. "Stay." He backed away, his heart pounding. His friends joined him in the hallway, and they huddled together, each one too scared to sleep alone. They decided to sit in the living room, where they lit every candle they could find and tried to stay awake. Hours passed, and they talked in low voices, trying to distract themselves. But the whispers returned, this time echoing from every corner, seeping through the walls. "Stay. Stay. Stay." The voices were louder now, coming from beneath the floor, from behind the walls, even from above, as if the cabin itself was alive, breathing, watching them. Sarah clasped her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth as the voices grew louder, more insistent. And then, without warning, the whispering stopped. For a moment, there was a complete, unnerving silence, broken only by the sound of the fire crackling. Jack dared to stand up, his ears straining for any sound, any hint of what was coming next. That's when he saw it, a dark, faintly human silhouette standing in the corner of the room, just outside the circle of light. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, watching them. Do you see that?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes locked on the figure. The others nodded, frozen in terror. The shadowy figure seemed to grow darker, its outline shifting and blurring, as if it were melting into the shadows around it. And then it spoke. Not in whispers this time, but in a deep, guttural voice that echoed through the room. "You cannot leave," it said, each word dragging like nails across a chalkboard. "This place is ours." Jack took a step back, nearly stumbling over a chair as the figure advanced, its shape growing taller, filling the room with an oppressive darkness. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening, suffocating. Panicked, they made a break for the door, but no matter how hard they pulled, the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the cabin itself was holding them prisoner, refusing to let them leave. Desperate, Jack grabbed a chair and swung it against the window. The glass shattered, and he clambered out, pulling Emma and Sarah after him, their breaths ragged with fear. Cole was the last to exit, and as he climbed out of the broken window, he glanced back one last time. The shadowy figure was standing by the door, its face, or what might have been its face, twisted in a silent scream of rage, eyes burning with an unnatural light. They ran through the woods, stumbling over roots and branches tearing at their skin, not stopping until they reached the main road where their car was parked. Only then did they look back, gasping, their hearts racing. The cabin stood in the distance, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But as they climbed into the car and began to drive away, they could hear it, the faintest whisper trailing after them, growing softer but never quite disappearing. Stay. Stay. They never spoke about that night again, and they never returned to the cabin. But sometimes, late at night, each of them would hear it, a whisper in the silence, a voice calling their name, reminding them of the secrets it knew, urging them to return. And no matter how hard they tried, they could never shake the feeling that somewhere, in the dark, the cabin was waiting for them. Story 3. The Midnight Knock. Michael had always prided himself on being rational. As a bachelor in his late 30s living alone, he enjoyed the quiet routines of his evenings. He'd often sit in his armchair by the window with a good book and a cup of tea, lulled by the solitude of his little house on the outskirts of town. But on a crisp winter night, everything changed. It was just past midnight when he heard the first knock. A soft, persistent tapping on his front door echoed through the stillness. Startled, Michael set his book aside and checked his watch. 12:07 a.m. was an odd hour for visitors, especially in a neighborhood like his, where houses were spaced far apart and strangers rarely ventured out. His immediate thought was that it might be an emergency. Curious yet cautious, he peered through the narrow window next to the door. What he saw made his stomach lurch. Standing on his porch, bathed in the cold light of the street lamp, was a young boy. He looked no older than 7 or 8, wearing an old-fashioned coat much too thin for the freezing weather, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes, dark and hollow, gazed unblinking at Michael's front door, and he was utterly motionless, save for his hand, which was still raised in a slow, rhythmic knock. Michael's rational mind quickly scanned for explanations. Perhaps the boy was lost, or maybe he'd run away from home. He wanted to help, but something about the child's unblinking stare sent a chill through his spine. He decided to wait and see if the boy would leave on his own. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped. Michael exhaled, telling himself that the boy must have realized he wasn't going to get an answer and left. He waited a few more minutes, straining his ears for any sound, then slowly headed back to his bedroom. But sleep did not come easily, as the child's hollow eyes haunted his mind. The following night, at precisely 12:07 a.m., the knock returned. Michael sat bolt upright in bed, his heart pounding. The knocking was the same, soft, steady, unrelenting. He checked the time, exactly the same as the previous night. Dread coiled in his chest as he went to the window, where he saw the boy standing in the same spot on the porch, his hand raised, his eyes fixed on the door. This time, Michael's unease turned to frustration. He opened the door just enough to peer out, his voice stern but controlled. "Can I help you? Are you lost?" The boy didn't respond. He simply stared, his eyes empty, unblinking, as if he couldn't understand the words. He seemed unreal, like a figure from a black and white photograph brought to life. The silence stretched on, and Michael's discomfort grew unbearable. "Go home, please." "It's late," Michael said, his voice wavering slightly. But the boy did not move, and after a moment, he simply turned, walked off the porch, and vanished into the shadows at the edge of the yard. The next morning, Michael called the local police to report the incident, describing the boy in detail. The officer on the other end seemed skeptical, but he promised to keep an eye out. Michael's mind, however, was already busy with possibilities. Who was this boy? Why did he appear only at midnight? And why wouldn't he speak? Despite his resolve to brush off the strange encounter, Michael felt a growing sense of dread as the day slipped away, and when midnight approached, he found himself tensely waiting by the door. 12:07 a.m. came, and the knock began again, just as before. For the next week, the knocking became a nightly ritual, always at the same time, never a moment sooner or later. Each night, the boy stood there, silent and motionless, knocking in the same slow, deliberate rhythm. Michael tried ignoring it, locking his door, turning up the television to drown out the sound, but nothing worked. The boy was relentless, his presence an unshakable weight pressing down on Michael's mind. As the nights passed, Michael's sanity began to fray. Sleep became a luxury as the dread of the midnight knock haunted his every moment. On the 8th night, he decided to confront the boy. Enough was enough, he was going to find out who this child was, or he would drag him to the authorities himself. When the clock struck 12:07 a.m., Michael was ready. He flung open the door, his anger boiling over. But the sight that met his eyes stopped him cold. The boy was there, standing even closer than before, his face barely a foot from Michael's. His eyes were still hollow, but his mouth was now open, stretching in a wide, unnatural grin. His lips curled back, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. What do you want?" Michael stammered, stepping back. The boy tilted his head, his grin widening. And for the first time, he spoke. "I'm cold." His voice was a raspy whisper, barely audible, each word punctuated by a sickening smile that made Michael's skin crawl. "Won't you let me in?" Michael felt his blood turn to ice. There was something deeply wrong, something inhuman, about the way the boy spoke, as though he was imitating a child but missing the mark. "No," Michael managed, his voice shaking. He slammed the door and locked it, pressing his back against it as he tried to calm his racing heart. He waited, listening, but the knocking had stopped. Minutes passed, and the house fell into silence once more. Exhausted, Michael slumped down to the floor. But just as he began to relax, he heard it again, the slow, rhythmic knock. This time, however, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the window, just beside him. He turned, his heart pounding, and saw the boy's face pressed against the glass. His eyes were empty, his mouth still twisted in that unnatural grin, and his hand was tapping the window with a patient, deliberate rhythm. The boy mouthed the words silently, but Michael understood them all the same. "Let me in." Michael backed away, heart racing, his mind spinning. He turned on every light in the house, desperately trying to rid himself of the oppressive darkness, but the boy's face remained at the window, his unblinking eyes tracking Michael's every movement. Over the next few nights, the boy continued to knock, not only on the door but on every window in the house, each night drawing closer, each night pressing his hollow gaze deeper into Michael's mind. No matter where he went, no matter how he tried to escape, the boy was there, knocking, grinning, whispering, "Let me in." One evening, in a final act of desperation, Michael decided to leave town. He packed a bag, threw it in his car, and drove away, leaving the house and its haunting behind. As he sped down the dark, empty highway, he felt a growing sense of relief, as though he were finally free of the boy's relentless knocking. Hours passed, and as the first light of dawn broke on the horizon, Michael allowed himself to relax. He pulled into a rest stop, stretched his legs, and leaned against the car, breathing in the cold, crisp air. He had made it. He was free. But as he looked around, he noticed something that made his heart sink. There, standing a few yards away, was the boy. He hadn't moved, hadn't changed, but his grin was wider now, more triumphant, his eyes glinting with a knowing malice. Michael staggered backward, his mind reeling, as the boy raised his hand, his fingers curling into a slow, deliberate knock in the air. "Let me in." Michael fled, running until his legs ached, but no matter where he went, the boy was there, always a few steps behind, knocking, waiting, following him through every town, every stop. Days turned into weeks, and Michael's world shrank, consumed by the constant, maddening sound of the knock that haunted him, growing louder, more insistent. He no longer had a home, no longer knew rest or comfort. The boy was everywhere, by the road, in his hotel mirrors, at the edge of the woods. And with each passing day, the knock grew louder, echoing in his mind, filling every thought, every heartbeat. Months later, Michael was found wandering the edge of a frozen lake, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes vacant and hollow. When they brought him to a shelter, he spoke only one phrase, his voice a desperate whisper that echoed in the quiet room. "Let me in, please, let me in." Story 4. The Reflection. Emma had always felt a peculiar sense of unease when she was alone. It was subtle, creeping up on her whenever she found herself in quiet spaces, her kitchen late at night, her empty office, and especially her bathroom, where the mirror seemed to draw her gaze without warning. The feeling grew stronger in recent months, like an unseen presence lurking at the edge of her vision, a sensation that prickled the back of her neck. She convinced herself it was stress, a trick of the mind, but it was persistent. It was worse at night, in the silence of her small apartment, where the hum of the refrigerator was the only noise. Sometimes, she'd glance over her shoulder, convinced she'd seen movement in the corner of her eye. But every time, there was nothing. One night, while brushing her teeth, Emma's discomfort escalated into something she couldn't ignore. Her bathroom mirror was foggy from her evening shower, the soft glow of the light above her casting dim reflections. As she leaned forward to rinse her mouth, her eyes caught something behind her. There, in the blurred reflection, stood a dark figure. Emma's blood ran cold. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she whipped around, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. The room was empty. She was alone, just as she had been moments before. With a shaky breath, she looked back into the mirror, scanning every inch of it. The steam still clung to the glass, and there was nothing unusual, no shadow, no figure. She laughed nervously, blaming her overactive imagination, and turned off the bathroom light. But when she climbed into bed, she couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure lingering behind her, watching in silence. For the next few nights, Emma did her best to avoid looking into mirrors altogether. She brushed her teeth quickly, washed her face in the kitchen sink, and kept the lights off in the bathroom. But every time she passed a reflective surface, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and a cold sensation crawled up her spine. Then, a week later, it happened again. Emma was brushing her teeth, determined to ignore the gnawing feeling of being watched, when she felt the pull to look up. Hesitantly, she raised her eyes to the mirror. The shadowy figure was there again, but closer this time, its form clearer. It was still indistinct, a murky, human-like shape with no face or features. Her breath hitched as the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, its hand lifting as if to touch her. Emma felt frozen, her hand gripping the sink, unable to look away as the figure's hand pressed against the glass from the other side, stretching toward her reflection. She could see long, dark fingers curling against the surface, pressing as though it was trying to break through. The instant the figure's hand made contact with the glass, Emma snapped out of her trance, stumbling backward. Her toothbrush clattered to the floor, and she darted out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind her. She stood in her bedroom, heart racing, gasping for breath as her mind tried to make sense of what she'd seen. There had been no one there, she reasoned. It was impossible. She'd been imagining things, she told herself. But deep down, she knew that was a lie. The next morning, she avoided the bathroom altogether. She threw on clothes, grabbed her things, and left her apartment without glancing at the mirrors lining her hall. All day at work, she was distracted, her thoughts lingering on that shadowy figure. She could feel its presence, even now, as if it had followed her beyond the walls of her home. Emma decided to stay with her best friend, Clara, that night. She needed the company, a distraction, and maybe even a good laugh to help her shake the eerie feeling that was clinging to her. Clara welcomed her with open arms, eager for a sleepover. They spent the evening watching movies, laughing and reminiscing, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Clara's apartment felt different from hers, warmer, less tense, but every time Emma caught her reflection in the TV screen, she thought she saw a faint shadow moving behind her. "You okay, Em?" Clara asked, noticing her friend's nervous glances around the room. Emma hesitated, trying to put her experience into words. I keep seeing something in mirrors. It sounds crazy, but there's this shadow, this figure. It was in my mirror at home, but I swear I've been seeing it here too." Clara's expression turned serious. She placed a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. "Hey, maybe you're just overtired. Stress does weird things to people." Emma nodded, grateful for Clara's logic. But when she lay down that night, staring up at the ceiling in the darkness, she felt it again, that creeping sensation, a prickling awareness of eyes on her. And when she closed her eyes, she dreamt of mirrors. In her dream, she stood in a dark, endless hallway lined with mirrors, each one reflecting her own terrified face. But behind her reflection, the shadow was there, always closer, reaching for her with each step. She ran, but no matter how far she went, it was always there, closing in, filling the mirrors. She woke with a start, sweat dampening her forehead. But as she opened her eyes, her heart skipped a beat. Standing by Clara's dresser was the shadowy figure, more distinct than ever, its head tilted slightly as though it was watching her sleep. Emma gasped, and the figure melted away, disappearing into the darkness. Her scream woke Clara, who rushed to her side, but Emma couldn't explain what she'd seen, her words tumbling out in broken fragments. "I saw it. It was here, in your room, watching me." Clara did her best to comfort her, but Emma knew what she'd seen. The figure wasn't confined to her apartment. It had followed her here, like a sinister attachment, lurking in every mirror and shadow. Unable to bear it any longer, Emma decided to move out of her apartment altogether. She packed up her belongings within days, leaving behind every mirror she owned, determined to rid herself of whatever was haunting her. She found a new place across town, a small, bright studio with large windows that let in plenty of sunlight. She refused to bring in any mirrors, using only her phone's camera for makeup and checking her appearance. For a few weeks, things seemed to improve. The unease faded, the constant feeling of being watched diminished. She slept better, her nightmares dwindling to nothing. But one night, while unpacking a box she'd forgotten about, she found an old hand mirror, an antique her grandmother had given her years ago. She had forgotten it was there, tucked away among her belongings. She hesitated, feeling a surge of dread, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It was the last keepsake she had of her grandmother, and she felt a pang of guilt at the thought of discarding it. That night, she left it on her dresser, telling herself it was harmless. But when she turned off the lights and settled into bed, the feeling returned. She couldn't resist the urge to look at the mirror, as though some invisible force was pulling her to it. Against her better judgment, she glanced over, squinting in the dim moonlight. The shadow was there, clearer than ever. It stood within the mirror's small frame, almost lifelike, a tall, dark figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through her. But this time, it wasn't still. It moved. Emma watched in horror as the figure's hand reached out, pressing against the inside of the glass. She heard the faintest scraping sound as its fingers dragged across the surface, trying to break through. Her body froze, her breath hitching as the figure leaned closer, its hollow eyes locking onto hers, its mouth stretching into a dark, empty void. It began to speak, its voice a distorted whisper, like wind through dead trees. "Emma, come closer." The voice was soft, hypnotic, filling her mind with a fog of dread. She found herself inching closer, her body moving against her will, her hand reaching toward the mirror. "Come home." Just as her fingertips brushed the cold glass, Emma snapped back, yanking her hand away. She grabbed the mirror, her heart pounding as she fought the impulse to listen, to let it in. She threw the mirror face down on her dresser, backing away from it as though it might come alive. She hardly slept that night, and when the first light of dawn crept through her window, she took the mirror outside, clutching it tightly. She walked to the edge of a nearby forest and, with all her strength, smashed it against a tree. The glass shattered, fragments scattering across the ground, each shard glinting in the early morning sun. She watched them, hoping the figure was finally gone. But even now, weeks later, Emma's fear lingers. She avoids mirrors, refusing to look at her reflection for more than a few seconds, but sometimes, she catches a glimpse of something, a faint, dark shadow moving just behind her. She's never certain if it's really there, but in her heart, she knows the truth. The shadow, the figure that haunted her, is waiting, hiding just out of sight, watching her from every mirror, waiting for the moment she lets her guard down. And Emma wonders, with a shiver, if it will ever stop following her, or if, one day, she will finally be pulled into its world, trapped behind the glass with no way to escape.